Good afternoon, members and guests. I'm Renee James, the chair of the President's National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee, the NSTAC. I'd like to introduce Mr. Scott Charney, the NSTAC Vice Chair, and thank all of you for taking the time to be here today for our May 2018 NSTAC meeting. It's a pleasure to see all of you, and I'd like to recognize several of our distinguished government partners who are participating today. Mr. David Riedel will be joining us, I believe, from the Department of Commerce. To my left, right, if you're on the camera, Mr. Grant Schneider, the Senior Director of Cybersecurity Policy at the National Security Council, and Mr. Chris Krebs, further down the table here, the National Protection and Programs Directorate, Undersecretary, appointee. Additionally, we are going to have some debaters today. I'd like to welcome our debaters, Dr. Ian Levy from the United Kingdom National Cybersecurity Center, and Mr. Philip Reitlinger, I hope I said that correctly, the Global Cyber Alliance. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. I don't know if Philip's here yet, and we will look forward to the debate. We last met, the NSTAC last met in November via conference call. During that meeting, we voted to approve the NSTAC report to the President on the Internet and Communications Resilience. For today, we have several items on the agenda. Our first order of business is we will receive a keynote address, I hope, from the Department of Commerce. Then we are going to move to the debate, which we're all looking forward to, around cybersecurity. And following the debate, we are going to have an update on a current study topic from the co-chairs, Mr. Mark McLaughlin and Mr. Peter Altebeff, on the cybersecurity moonshot. And after that, they'll give us an update on the subcommittee's work, and that is the summary of business for today. So thank you again for joining us, and with that, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Schneider for any opening remarks.
Thank you, Renee. Thank you, Scott, and thank you to the NSTAC members for your participation on the NSTAC, for the continued 30 years now of excellent advice that you've been able to provide to the administration, to a number of course, different administrations. I want to welcome everyone here to the White House for the meeting of the NSTAC. We're excited to host here, excited to hear about the work that's ongoing, really look forward to the ways that we, from a policy standpoint, can take the recommendations from the NSTAC as we have in the past and really roll those into our policy development on around telecommunications, specifically around cybersecurity as well, how we can better secure the nation because we are so dependent both in our personal lives and our professional lives on all the advantages that technology brings to us. With that come a number of risks that we have to deal with and mitigate, and that continues to be an increasing threat surface that we have to deal with, and therefore we need to be more agile in our ability to mitigate for those threats and really address our infrastructure. So appreciate the great work that you and your organizations have put into this. Appreciate everyone's participation here, both in the room and online, and look forward to the discussion going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Mr. Krebs, do you have any opening remarks?
Thank you, Renee. A couple opening remarks on behalf of the Department of Homeland Security and Secretary Nielsen. This is actually a fairly significant week or two in terms of cybersecurity. Just last week was the one-year anniversary of Executive Order 13636. Also on Tuesday of this week, the Secretary released the Department of Homeland Security Cybersecurity Strategy, which broadly details the elements that the Department of Homeland Security, whether it's within my organization, the National Protection and Programs Directorate, or the Secret Service, ICE, U.S. Coast Guard, Science and Technology Directorate, all the components of the department, how we're addressing the cybersecurity problem. It has 5 pillars, 5 elements of the plan. Risk identification is the first element, really truly understanding what the issues are out there and contextualizing the threat. Reducing vulnerabilities is the second pillar. The third is reducing threats. Fourth is mitigating consequences. And fifth is enabling cybersecurity outcomes, improved cybersecurity outcomes. So when I step back from the National Protection and Programs Directorate within DHS, which leads the cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection activities of the department, I view the cybersecurity challenge right now from a national risk management lens, and that's taking elements of the threat with the underlying vulnerabilities that exist within our critical infrastructure community, and then extrapolating from there the consequences. And that really breaks down to two separate questions once you put your arms around the risk. The first is, so what? What does it mean? What is truly important that we have to address and where we are managing risk? And the second question is, now that we understand risk, what are we going to do about it? And that's why groups like this, NSTAC, and some of the other advisory councils, of getting a true appreciation from industry, not just about what you're worried about, but how can the U.S. government help you manage your risk? You own the risk, how can we help you? So as a part of that, we are working to truly identify the requirements that exist in industry and create a demand signal, or at least better understand the demand signal out of industry, and then use what's the unique capabilities of the federal government, whether it's intelligence, threat intelligence from classified sources, deregulation, policy reform, smarter regulation, things like that. How can we work together to make your ability to manage your risk easier? What really underpins all of this, though, is the concept of collective security. No one company in this room can address the problem by themselves. The U.S. government, we cannot address this problem by themselves. The United Kingdom, same, can't address it by themselves. How do we address the problem together? We know we have a common adversary. How do we work collectively to achieve the better security outcomes that are all going to make the world a better place? So, looking forward to the debate and some of the other remarks today, and thank you for having us here today.
Thank you, Mr. Krebs. I'm going to, in light of, we have quite a bit of weather, as everyone knows, here in Washington, D.C., and I think Mr. Riedel from the Department of Commerce is running late. I'm going to suggest that we move to item number 2 on the agenda, the great thinking debate on cybersecurity. And gentlemen, since you are both present, and thank you for that, I would like to introduce the two individuals who are going to debate. I am not going to moderate the debate unless something goes on down there and I need to intercede. I was going to introduce you, but I think it would be very interesting for each one of you to introduce yourselves briefly. We have 35 minutes for this topic. Both of you have developed and run national-scale cybersecurity programs, which is pretty unique, and I think all of the members and others that are attending will learn a lot from your very spirited dialogue. And you can tell us if you want us to involve ourselves in your debate, otherwise we'll be innocent bystanders. So with that, Dr. Levy, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself first and then take it away.
Thank you very much. So I'm Ian Levy. I'm the Technical Director for the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre. We think we are unique at the moment as a government organisation. The UK's National Cybersecurity Strategy is, we think, unique as well, because it says a bit more than, you should all work harder and share more information and it'll be okay. There's 3 big parts to our strategy. The first one is, have a single point of authority in government that can do all the cyber stuff. For me, that's really important because cybersecurity for me is about harm management and harm reduction. So much like Chris was saying, rather than chase the vulnerabilities. And if you are a victim, you want one place to go, not 20. And we've seen that in spades over the years. Victims get harmed more because government is stupid. So we're trying to be less stupid. Second thing is intervene in the market where the market doesn't work. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in cybersecurity where the incentive models are broken, where there's no incentive for people to do the right thing. How can government intervene in those to try and make it better? And the third thing is, let's have some data and some evidence. Let's measure stuff. Let's try and have an intervention and see what that intervention actually does by measuring stuff. If you can't measure it, you can't fix it. Our mantra is automate first. If we can't automate it, it's not going to scale. And so I'm genuinely interested to see what everybody here has to say. I think it's going to be a great half an hour. Phil and I are old friends and we can throw things at each other, so that should be good fun. But yeah, looking forward to it. Phil.
Thanks, Ian. Good to see you all again. The last time I was in this meeting, I was sitting up at the head of the table, so it's good to have an opportunity to come back. I guess I'll say something as a former U.S. government employee that perhaps I shouldn't, which is that I've spent a lot of time working through multiple countries' strategies and how they're approaching cybersecurity, and it's, in my humble opinion, the UK is the gold standard right now. And the reason the UK is the gold standard is that their strategy is a mixture of really large common goals that everyone should meet, but then very tactical outcomes that they want to drive. So in the nature of getting something done, getting something real done, their national strategy does things like mention specific technologies like DMARC and DNS that they want to drive out, and it discusses specifically how they're going to measure the outcomes that they're trying to achieve. That gives it a degree of concreteness that you don't see elsewhere. If you go back, now, it's unfair to criticize this, but if you go back to the 2003 national strategy, which I think is still formally the national strategy of the US. I don't know if any of you remember the national strategy to secure cyberspace. It had this nice blue and white cover sheet, but it's chock full of recommendations like encourage industry to consider something. So that's two levels of indirection. You're not going to consider, but you're going to encourage somebody to consider, and it's done in the passive voice. So it's harder to take a weaker stand than that, and that was because in that frame in 2003, a lot of us were still in the market will solve everything problems, and I think history has shown the market will not solve everything. There's some active roles the government needs to have. So the UK strategy goes beyond that and has particular outcomes that it's trying to achieve. I think that's a quick opening statement. The one is, it's easy to gild this problem. It's easy to think about it as being more complex than it is. And it is really complex. I mean, it's a beautiful problem. Now, I could sit there and look at this problem all day and think about the different elements of it. But you can describe things that need to happen in a fairly simple way. And then what it really takes is action. It takes concrete, hard action around those items that you need to execute on. Action in line with a bigger goal, something that you really want to achieve, something that, apropos of what was said before, might be thought of as a cyber moonshot. Don't need to argue whether that's the right analogy or not. There are good parts of it, there are bad parts of it. The question is there something really big you want to achieve, and what is that?
So,
well,
when you said you weren't going to moderate, you really meant you weren't going to moderate.
if you'd like me to moderate, I am happy to do so. There are many things we want to achieve. I thought you guys were going to self-moderate. You have a lot of questions. You want to jump right in? Yeah. I think it would be good, actually, because we do have viewers and others that don't know what you've built, to just at a very brief but high level kind of just go through what does a national cybersecurity, at scale, what does that look like? What have you done?
Okay, so we've done a number of technical interventions. So I think there's 8 words that will strike fear into the heart of any business. I'm from the government, I'm here to help. Right? That's not usually a good thing. What we've decided is anything we're going to recommend to somebody else, we're going to do to government first. So we're going to eat our own dog food, prove that the thing has the effects we think it does, and then go and ask others to do the same thing, or encourage them. The sorts of things that we're talking about doing at the moment are things like, let's make email mean something again. Email is the primary attack vector for most cyber attack. It doesn't have to be like that. We can change it. We can make it harder to abuse email. So we've been doing some work to make it much, much harder to abuse government email addresses, to spoof them. We've done some work about taking down deceptive domains, where people register domains that look like they are government domains in order to fool people into divulging passwords or credit card details or whatever. We've done some work around filtering all access to government from government systems. So we have become the DNS provider for public sector. And we currently serve about 170 organisations. We currently do about 3 billion queries a week, and we currently block about 300,000 of them. And for each of those blocks, I can say, well, I know what it was that the government person was trying to get to. It was a phishing site. Well, okay, that's not so great. It was malware command and control. Ooh, that's bad. It was an unknown DNS tunneling algorithm. Well, that's really bad. And we've spotted some stuff in DNS that, even though these departments have got lots and lots of cybersecurity products in their networks, we just didn't know about. We've done some stuff around doing takedowns. So how do I make phishing less harmful to UK citizens and the UK less harmful globally as a hoster? And we've done some really cool stuff. Like, it used to be the fact that if you hosted a phishing site in a UK hoster, it would last for about a day before somebody would take it down. It's now about an hour. So even if those mails still get delivered, even if somebody clicks the link, after about an hour, the link doesn't go anywhere. And so you can start to reduce harm. And for me, this is much more about a harm reduction strategy than a vulnerability management strategy. So what we're trying to do in the UK is build an evidence base in an automated way to take away the majority of commodity cybercrime, commodity cyber attack. So the systems we're building, we've published a 70-page report detailing how it works. The systems we're building at the moment are intended to protect the majority of people in the UK from the majority of harm, from the majority of attacks, the majority of the time. This is not trying to automate away the Russians. That's not going to happen. What it does is reduces the noise so that my well-trained, highly skilled network defenders can look after the bad stuff that I can't automate away. We link all of that through with incident management. So again, if you can't measure it, you can't fix it. We are the national response function for incidents in the UK. And that doesn't matter whether it's government, CNI, the National Lottery, whatever. We are the national authority for incident management. And so we get to see what the root cause of all of these incidents are. We've been going about 18 months now. We've done nearly 1,000 incidents. And that's incidents where it's appropriate for the government to get involved. The thing that worries me is, of all of those 1,000 incidents, whether it was done by nation states or spotty 15-year-olds in their bedroom, whether it was against critical infrastructure or a business or government, they all come down to the same small number of really simple things that are being exploited. And when I talk about automation, one of the things we're going to try and do next is say, well, if an attacker can find these things, why can't I? Why don't we just start thinking like an attacker? Attackers do random scans of the internet, try and find open telnet ports, then just hammer credentials into them. We can do that. Why don't we go do that and try and find some of this stuff early on and fix it? So in summary, the UK strategy is about automation, evidence, and interventions.
So, thanks, Ian. Let me say a couple of things in response. The UK approach is one that's being used much more broadly. For example, the Canadians and the Australians have essentially both followed the UK approach of having a subsidiary national cybersecurity center that reports up to the intelligence branch. It's really much harder to do that in the United States, and we've had a presidential directive for a few years that really divides responsibilities into three pieces: asset response, intelligence or law enforcement response, deterrence, if you will, and then intelligence or threat response, with, in order, Homeland Security, Justice, and the Defense Department being the leads in those spaces, with a stronger coordination piece in the White House. I think it's somewhat difficult to get things tighter than that here, in part because of the historic degree of suspicion we as a people have had around the intelligence community and the political obstacles to that. It's also true that the general movement of the intelligence community here has been away from the model that GCHQ, for example, has used, because we used to have a body similar to NCSC called IAD, and IAD became a part of the operations directorate. So the information security mission was mixed into the overall operations mission. That actually makes it, I think, more difficult to use the model that you've got. But it's clear that you need national leadership. It's something that we've had provided for a while. I'll just depart for a moment. I know Rob Joyce isn't here anymore, but I would like to briefly say what a spectacular job Rob did and the people in Homeland Security have done over the last year in moving us forward. Rob was a singular talent, and I deeply miss the ability to work with him on every day. I hope we'll see that sort of capability continue. There are some very good things, I think, that have happened in the national cybersecurity strategy in the United States. When the president released his executive order shortly, but after he was elected, you saw in that executive order there were not a departure from the past, but a doubling down on the past. And it identified a couple of key things. One, Mr. Krebs mentioned at the start, which is really doubling down on risk management and trying to make federal agencies responsible and accountable for how they do security. And I think that is absolutely essential. The other thing, and perhaps the most important thing, something that's been needed for a long time, is I think we need to get almost everybody, I will say government for this, but I think it's much broader than government, out of the IT business. Not just out of the information security business, but out of the IT business. And what I mean by that is there was a direction in both CNAP in the prior administration and the executive order in the current administration to move agencies to shared services in the cloud. And you talked about scale. I would say that when I think about things like a cyber moonshot, what I think about is scale. How do you solve the problem of scale, which is the overarching problem of almost everything in cybersecurity? Some of it's complexity, but complexity actually kind of rolls up to scale. So the only real way to get that done is people don't scale. People will never scale. So you have to, as you said, Ian, use automation. And the easiest way to get widespread scalable automation around security is to get people into a shared service or cloud environment. So it's also, I think, the only way in the long term that the US government's going to be able to keep up with industry, which, while it's always been a little bit farther ahead in at least some ways, historic or in the future, that's not going to be the case. And we're going to see industry outstripping government capabilities. So if they go to cloud-related services, they'll get what industry's getting, and they'll get the additional agility out of it. Let me turn to just, so as not to ask Renee to sort of ask more questions than necessary. Okay.
I am prepared to moderate.
All right. So
if you'd like.
With you before you move on.
What?
Oh, no. So the bit about federal government is complicated and there's these 27,000 different organisations that have to work together, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, fine. But as a victim, I don't care. That's not my problem. Right? You have to find some way of helping the people who are harmed by this stuff. And because government's complicated, because how you set it up, sorry, that's not a good enough excuse anymore. Right? There has to be a way of hiding all of that complexity from the people who shouldn't care about it. And one of the things, I mean, it came out in spades during the, there was a small ISP in the UK called TalkTalk. They got done over, and the CEO went to the National Cybercrime Unit and said, hey, been done. And they went, cybercrime, awesome. It's a Bitcoin ransom. Ooh, extortion, that's the Met Police. So she went to the Met Police and they went, oh, extortion, that's us. Yeah, cybercrime, that's the National Cybercrime Unit, sorry. And she went, but they've just sent us here. And what she said was, in that first day, nobody cared about the company. Not a single person in government cared about whether that company lived or died. That's part of why the NCSC was set up. We are not law enforcement. Law enforcement still has a vital part to play in incident response and incident management, but we hide the complexity from the victims. You have to be able to build something like that, otherwise all of the protective stuff you do is going to be for naught because the harm will still accrue.
So, I'd love to argue with on that, but I think that's absolutely right. We have had conversations before. I can't say this is still true, but if there's an information security breach, this used to be true. If it was in DoD and it was on like an Army base, it still might not be Army CID, Criminal Investigative Division, that investigated that. It actually depends on who administered that system, right? So it could be the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, and so the level of complexity in this country can just soar. It'll take a lot of political will to fix that. I'd actually double down on what you said about hiding complexity. Right, so when I think about the overall strategy here, it turns on something that Wendy Nather, a well-known cybersecurity personality, hacker type, calls the cybersecurity poverty line. Right, so there's the people below the cybersecurity poverty line that can't afford cybersecurity. No ifs, ands, or buts. They just can't afford it. And there's people above who can. It's a little less binary than that, but you get the idea. Right, for everybody below that cybersecurity poverty line, it's all about hiding complexity. It's about, as I like to say, we've got to stop trying to teach people to farm in cybersecurity. We have to give them food. They don't want to know how to secure their own systems. They just want to get delivery of secure systems. And to expect that, for us to expect them to do anything else is just ridiculous. And so there's some challenges in government on that end, and there's some challenges from industry, and there's a need for government to lead that transfer. That's actually why I think things like the cloud, along with some other things like security UIs and building security into particular products, are so essential. When you are in the cloud, you're getting, for example, you're running a business, you want an HR service, you're getting security embedded in that. Somebody else is handling the security scalability for you. So managing complexity, getting rid of complexity, and attacking scale is a huge lift across the entire ecosystem, both political and technical and business process.
But again, I think there's some really simple things we could do first, that we have evidence cause harm. So there's a guy called Sinon Reborn, the internet prankster. So he had a go at a bunch of people in the US. He basically sends spoofed emails, makes people look stupid when they reply. So he had a go at me, and I was really, really, really lucky and I spotted it. But we ended up having a conversation, and we published a joint blog on the NCSC website. If you've not read it, go and have a look at it, because it's got screenshots of my phone about the mails that he sent me. It's got him going, here is what I was trying to do when I sent this message, and me going, here's what it felt like. You look at that blog, and then tell me if anybody on the planet could have spotted that that was a spoof. Right? Because it's impossible. I was really lucky. And so while we are giving people advice that says don't open a link or an attachment or a link in an email unless you trust it, and give them no way to make that judgment, we are not doing our duty properly. And that's been true for 25 years, and we've still not fixed it. So if I want a moonshot, I'd like companies to stop complaining about UI and give people high quality data that they can actually do something with. Help people make decisions in the spur of the moment. Give them the opportunity to do the right thing by default, because that's what we are not doing today.
So I agree with most of what you said. I would say it's not giving people the data to make the right decision, in my view. It's normally just giving them the right decision by default and making it really, really hard to make the wrong decision. Now, a lot of people are going to want to make the wrong decision, and I'm generally okay with that if they want to really go out of their way and do something incredibly stupid, and then you can assign them with some cost. But I think overall the approach is right. I'd like to do a shout out to some of the things that the U.S. government is doing. For example, the UK government about 2 years ago now required deployment of a technology called DMARC, which is one of those things, right? It actually stops spoofed phishing emails. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security followed suit in, I think, what was a real forward break for the U.S. government in mid-October of last year, and issued Binding Operational Directive 1801, which wasn't just about deployment of DMARC. It was deployment of DMARC and use of a number of other web security protocols for which there's no good reason not to require agencies to do. So a large chunk of this is actually saying, yeah, that's goodness, we're gonna require it, or we're gonna make it really painful to not do those sorts of things. Above that, it gets a little more complicated. When you're dealing with the idea of how to bring together all of these different players, it's a lot about making sure that people are working on the same direction. So if you think of sort of, a big problem that when you build out the interstate highway system, that everybody drives on the right, and everybody gets in a car and it does basic things for them.
It's the left.
Well, yeah, see? Obviously, there are some outliers. But it's really much more about driving those other pieces. I did want to say one thing, and this is probably opening up a new topic of conversation, that is, we've talked a little bit about what you need to do at the lower level, which is, in my mind, you just need to give people food. You need to give them security with connectivity of the service. It's got to be built in and automated, to use Ian's terminology. Above that, we need everybody working from the same sheet of music. The government can do really effective things around procurement, but the government is increasingly a smaller part of what is being bought in this space. So what do you do? Well, the best way to work that, in my opinion, this is not going to come as a shock to any of you, is to have the government influence industry standards, to use the same standards as industry procurement, and then to coordinate across government so they're all buying from the same sheet. Right? Because then that becomes really powerful, and that drives a market response. But there's a lot to do around alignment. The goal that I think is sort of the end game that everybody ought to be shooting for, that the moonshot ought to be focused on, both in terms of getting short-term things done and long-term things done, stems from, and we have to go back in ancient cyber history here, a 2011 paper issued by the United States Department of Homeland Security called Distributed Security in Cyberspace that laid out the notion, and it actually was influenced a lot, I know because I was in the Department of Homeland Security at the time, was influenced by the end-to-end trust thinking that Microsoft developed. And the notion there is that there were 3 primary building blocks. And I think you can expand it, you can add more, but that the pieces you needed to build out, that what you actually had to have is a system that defended itself for the most part. And so it's about automation, but it's really automation in the sense that the body's immune system is automation. Automated recognition of threats and response. And the essential building blocks for that, and I'm happy to have an argument or a debate with you, Ian, about whether these are the right blocks or not, were automation, interoperability, and authentication. That those were the 3 key pieces that you needed to build on to have a system that defended itself. And that you could, in the short term, whether you call it a moonshot or, as I think was happening in a prior meeting, roof shots, you can build on each of those pieces. You can build on automation, you can build on authentication, you can build on interoperability. So they're short-term actions. And indeed, most of the things that you would want to do, in a short-term government ought to act space fall into one of those buckets. Probably mostly in the automation space, but there are good chunks in both interop and authentication. And that will get you to a place where people, in fact, even most businesses get security when they plug in the Ethernet jack.
So I don't disagree. I think the problem is the economic incentive's broken. So there is no reason for people to buy security at the moment. There is no reason for most companies to invest in differentiating security because the procurement regulations are so Byzantine that you can work your way through them whether you do the right thing or not. What we're trying to do in the UK, so I totally agree that the market, differentiating people who invest in security is good. So IoT, okay? Everybody knows what IoT is, right? It's absolutely everything or it's absolutely nothing. And so there's lots of bits of work going on around the world about securing IoT. I don't understand how that works because securing an autonomous vehicle is different to securing a toaster, is different to securing a nuclear power plant, right? They're different things, but they're all IoT. One thing they all have in common, though, is a set of technical standards, objective technical standards that you can read out and go, anything, whether it's a kettle or a nuclear power plant, should do these things objectively. So we've documented those as part of our code of practice that we published a couple of months ago, and we're going to build a food label for 3 of them. Right, so over here, the food labels, you get, this has got 27,000 grams of sugar and 25 million grams of fat in it. That sort of thing. It's red, it's bad for you. So we're doing 3 things. Number 1, can you update this thing securely? And how long will you, the manufacturer, guarantee to provide updates? Does it have any default credentials? And can the credentials all be changed? And do you have a published vulnerability disclosure policy? Those 3 things. Start to build a market around those. Anybody can understand that. A use by date and 2 yes or no questions, where yes is better than no. Right, that's it. Start there. Do that for a couple of years, see what happens. Because I think in most of the things that we try and do, perfect is the enemy of the good. So yeah, we've got another 10 things behind that in terms of deep technical stuff, but people don't understand it yet. People don't understand the value of differentiating. If we can help them and say, you've got to have a lifetime of at least 2 years, you've got to do at least these 2 things. If you do those, government will buy it. If you don't, we won't. And we expect our friends to do likewise. That's when you can start to build a market around security, because I think that's what's missing. Something objective and simple that most people can understand around how to choose a good thing.
Again, I think that's right. My concern is that economic incentives for consumers may eventually develop, but the sort of the Smokey Bear element or the UL listing, we'd have to get to the point really where stores didn't sell stuff. Like you can't really go into a store and buy something that's not UL listed or whatever. I don't think incentives are a big problem for consumers. It's not, if you will, there's an ROI, there's a numerator and a denominator. And the problem is the denominator is the internet or the Internet of Things, right? And so the denominator is infinite. right? And additional incentives on the numerator almost don't make a difference. Unless it's got to be global. So I would say it's not really a numerator problem, it's a denominator problem, and that's good. The goal has got to be, I think for big industry and for those sorts of folks, you can create economic incentives. For consumers, I think it's really got to be built into the infrastructure. It's just got to be there.
So I disagree with you. So the reason we launched our Internet of Things Code of Practice with the Consumer Reports magazine, which is because consumers spend a lot more money than we do. Certainly than government does, and probably more than business if you add it all up. So I think it's called Consumer Reports here, ours is called Which. So we launched it with them, and they've gone out and started doing, right, you want to buy a fitness tracker for your kids, don't touch these because they're terrible. Right? And it's objective, so nobody can complain. And so I would like to see us build sort of Which reports for cybersecurity products and just take the crap away for people. Right? It's, the way we talk about this stuff is unintelligible to most people. We need to fix it.
I think that's right. I've lost too many hours of sleep and too many jobs over time trying to build awareness and drive individual decisions. God bless you. God bless you, and I hope you win. I have my doubts that piece will work, but it may get you to where you want. If Walmart stops selling stuff that doesn't meet the seal of approval, then you've gotten where you need to be. Wherever the Walmart is. So, there are different ways to get there, but I think that's right. Yep. I'd like to say one thing about you. You talked a little bit about doing basic things, right? I think that works really, really well, especially for the consumer spaces. If I hear, one more person say, well, X company was hacked because they failed to apply a patch, I have yet to meet the CISO who says, well, I could apply this patch right now, but I don't want to because I might get hacked, right? But for consumers, that sort of automated stuff is great, and there are ways you can build stuff into the infrastructure. So one of the things that the UK is doing is, as Ian mentioned, driving a public sector DNS. So DNS is a great way to just block access to bad sites, the domain name system. We've copied that a little bit, and this is where I work right now, and I won't do a big commercial for us, but we've created a global domain name system that blocks access to malicious sites. One of the prototype deployers for us was a US state, which used it as their default DNS before it went public. And just turning on a DNS service that blocks access to malicious sites, when they turned it on, cut their antivirus hits in half, and their intrusion detection systems by a third. Now, does that mean they're secure? No. Could the Russians or some other entity get in? Absolutely. It's not even a significant barrier. But was the noise reduction such that they had a significant amount of additional resource to apply to bigger problems? Absolutely. So there's so much that could be done simply by making security transparent and a part of connectivity.
And so we totally agree with that, and making security on by default for everybody is absolutely the right way to go. So we are working with the ISPs in the UK to have them provide protection by default for free for their residential, charity and SME customers. Right, so below your poverty line, the people who either can't afford or don't understand enough to protect themselves, how does their ISP protect them by default for free? We've had one ISP announced publicly, that's BT. So if you're a BT residential customer, you are protected by default unless you opt out, right, at the network layer. And yeah, you still have all your AV, you have all the other stuff, but we're starting to try and make the UK objectively safer. And if you can get across that, getting across this is government interference, this potential censorship, we've got answers for all of that about why objectively it's not. If you can get across that, and you can start to have people who are in the right position to do control functions, do them in a way that's open and transparent, you can fundamentally change the vulnerability of a country to attack. I genuinely believe that.
I just want a time check, sorry to interrupt. You have 5 minutes, or 4 minutes actually. And I want to make sure that if you have final thoughts for the industry members here on things you think they should be doing, or any recommendations that we hear them, or any questions from any of the NSTAC members.
I have a question for you guys, if you would. So I love it. I love the back and forth. So, right, should we put a little pond right here between you? I'm teasing. I love the example that you're using on email and website and malicious links and how government can really play both with the Global Cyber Alliance as well as what you're doing there. But one of the new domains, and I'm really curious how you're viewing this, is now the social platform being used for phishing and malicious pages. So our visibility in those networks are very different than they are with email and with DNS servers. So how do you see public-private partnership, particularly in the UK, and particularly, Phil, your sense too, and how do we get ahead of this with a relationship? Because this isn't just a Facebook, it's a WeChat, a WhatsApp, a Slack. I mean, the number of hubs are all over the world, and they're very different than that of the email website world. So how do you see that evolving?
So we're actually doing some experiments at the moment. So we are acting like a victim. So I will go on, not I, but somebody we pay goes onto Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc., and looks for things that they might look for government. So driver and vehicle licensing, tax, etc. And you find all sorts of weird stuff. So you find sites that are completely non-malicious, but the phone number is a premium rate phone number that just redirects you through to the real one. Okay, so we'll take those down because they're a bit pernicious, but they're not cybersecurity. The ones that are really interesting are the ones that you've just described, the malicious ones. And it's getting really interesting to try and understand how people decide what to spoof. Because for me, it's all about the incentives. Again, if we can disincentivize them and make them go to France instead, that'll do for now, right? That will do me for now. But if we can start to understand the business model behind this, then we can start to mess about with the business model, reduce their return on investment. Because I think going for technology limits you quite quickly. What I'd like to be able to get to is working with some of those providers to come up with analytics that say, you run these analytics, oh provider, this has nothing to do with government. When you spot something in your analytics that are probably a spoof, go have somebody look at it and just take it down. Because that's got to be the right way to do it. It has to be automated.
Dave, I don't really know that I've got any, in a democracy, that's a huge problem. I think the problem is essentially scale, and it's going to need to be, there's no solution that I know of now other than aggressive monitoring. And that can be done much more efficiently if you've got an automated way to look for your marks and those sorts of things. So I don't have that's one place I'll be looking for industry and startups to come up with a great approach.
So I've got one ask for the industry members.
Okay, great.
Please, please, please stop talking about cybersecurity as fear.
As what? Sorry?
Fear.
Fear.
Fear. Right? The way we talk about cybersecurity at the moment engenders fear in the population. And fear always, always, always drives a bad risk management response. We need to start talking about this in the way it really is. So, hands up if you've ever actually been done over by an advanced persistent threat at home, a nation state. It's probably nobody at home. Right? So why are we telling over and over again the population that the Russians are after their babies? Because on average they're not. They're much more likely to be harmed by cybercrime, identity theft, that sort of thing. So let's help them protect themselves better by giving them really good, grounded information in a way that they can consume that does not just engender fear.
Thank you. Phil, any final comments?
I think the main thing I'd say is sort of what I said before. You need to think about this, I think, in three buckets. What you're going to do for people below the cybersecurity poverty line, and how you're going to build security into everything they get so they don't have to worry about it. What you're going to do above the cybersecurity poverty line, so to align investments and make sure that everyone is driving. As Ian likes to say, I will tell you, I think there's insufficient investment here on the part below the poverty line. On above it, there probably is plenty of sufficient investment, but it's not being spent in the way that it ought to be spent. So it's a question of building the incentives and the framework and the standards and the rules of the road so that's all spent in the right way. The third piece is really metrics, how you're going to measure this, how you know what works and doesn't work. And all that needs to be built together if you're doing a moonshot with what's the ultimate goal, which for me, I think, I've never seen anybody, I can't think of any other way to approach it than to say you need an ecosystem that defends itself and that uses people for the things that people do well. And so how you get there is the only reasonable, real moonshot that I can think of.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. It was spirited. I like that. We appreciate it. I want to welcome Mr. David Riddle from the Department of Commerce. Thank you for joining us, and we're going to turn the floor over to you.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Renee, and it's going to be hard following Dr. Levy's ask that we not talk about fear. You then go to the government guy to talk about cybersecurity, so I'll try my best not to fall into that trap. Thank you to the committee members for having me and for the time that you all have devoted and for your service to our country. I really appreciate all the work that you all do to take time out of your days to participate in this process. Over the past 3 decades, the internet has transformed the American economy, as all of you know, creating a digital economy representing nearly 6.5% of the nation's GDP, or $1.2 trillion in 2016, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis at DOC. America's leadership in 4G networks helped create hundreds of thousands of U.S. jobs and led to a booming worldwide market for American hardware and software. And a new wave of connectivity is emerging now, facilitated by 5G mobile networks and innovation in the IoT marketplace. 5G has the potential to enable powerful broadband applications and nearly universal connectivity for people and for machines. And America's wireless industry is already pushing to be the front of the pack with 5G deployments, committing billions in new investment to build these next-gen networks. But we're not alone in this race, not by any stretch. Other countries are tapping industrial policy to take the lead in global standards and equipment development. And for America's 5G leadership to succeed, the entire government must work in a coordinated fashion with our private sector partners. From NTIA's perspective, this means making more spectrum available, removing obstacles to deployment, collaborating on global standards that will define how the 5G race unfolds, and ensuring we have a collective strategy to secure those 5G networks. As we focus on growth and innovation, we must also be mindful of the rapidly evolving cyber threat, something that you all spend a lot of your time thinking about. President Trump has made it clear that securing our communications networks is a national security priority, and our continued prosperity depends upon defeating attacks on networks and devices that threaten our security, our economy, and our trust in technology. A year ago, the President issued an executive order aimed at strengthening the cybersecurity of federal networks and critical infrastructure. The order mandated that all federal agencies use the cybersecurity framework developed by the National Institute for Standards and Technology, or NIST, and last month, NIST released version 1.1 of that framework, which shows how this voluntary approach can provide a first line of cyber defense. In January, the Departments of Commerce and Homeland Security delivered a draft report on how to improve the resilience of the internet and reduce the threat of botnets. We were directed to identify stakeholder actions, not government regulations, that could help solve this problem. Botnets and the cyber attacks they enable have been an issue since the early days of the internet, as everyone in this room is painfully aware. These attacks can be severely damaging, and the threats are constantly evolving, growing smarter and affecting some of America's most sophisticated companies. The Center for Strategic and International Studies estimates that close to $6 billion a year is lost to cybercrime. And the rapid expansion of IoT devices has fueled the scale of the attacks. The growth shows no signs of abating. Analysts at Gartner predict that there will be 20 billion IoT devices by 2020, up from about 11 billion. We spent a year throughout this process collecting broad input from experts and stakeholders in the federal government, in industry, in academia, and in civil society. We held 2 public workshops, analyzed over 100 responses to our requests for comments, and reviewed the NSTAC's report to the President on internet and communications resilience. We expect to deliver the final report to the President soon. But several broad themes emerged throughout the course of this work over the past year. Attacks are a global challenge for the entire internet ecosystem and cannot be solved in isolation. We must collaborate across sectors and involve all stakeholders in finding workable solutions. We must work closely with international partners, as the majority of compromised devices in recent botnet attacks have been located outside the United States. Many of the tools necessary for a more resilient internet already exist, but they just aren't widely used. We need to increase awareness and education and help align market incentives to promote a better balance between security and convenience. The administration will work with the private sector to coordinate on our plans based on the report's recommendations. I'd like to recognize and thank each of you for the hard work that went into your report on internet and communications resilience. Drawing on the collective communications expertise in this room, the report clearly identified the risks posed by IoT growth and priorities for addressing the threats posed to critical infrastructure. You called for a broad, multifaceted response developed through public-private cooperation. We agree. We agree that collaboration and partnerships will be critical in addressing these threats. The response we've received from stakeholders so far shows we have a solid foundation to build on. At Commerce, NIST is working to develop standards, specifications, and security mechanisms that will form security baselines for IoT devices. This will help accelerate the development of more secure IoT devices. And NTIA, the agency that I am the administrator of, later this summer will begin working with stakeholders to examine what's needed to foster a marketplace for greater software component transparency. Knowing what software has been incorporated into a product is a fundamental step toward being able to keep it updated and to block threats from doing damage. Our research into automated distributed attacks reveals that it's a fast-growing and fast-moving global problem. Defeating it will take committed effort by stakeholders to develop policies that will lead to secure and stable cyberspace. We've seen with other more regulatory approaches how things can go terribly wrong. Take, for instance, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. Implementation of these new expansive regulations on May 25th is a major concern for the US government. Many aspects of our government operations will be affected by GDPR, and the same is true for private sector companies of all sizes. GDPR is also threatening to upend the valuable WHOIS service, which could impede our collective work to curb distributed threats like botnets. While the United States government recognizes the importance of privacy protections and is committed to working with the EU to safeguard personal information, we're concerned that GDPR, as currently framed, creates serious and unclear legal obligations that could have widespread impact on transatlantic cooperation, law enforcement, and business operations. And so far, the EU's guidance issued for implementing the GDPR is vague and insufficient. American companies and the US government do not have an adequate basis on which to comply with the law. We're seeking a broader interpretation of Article 49 of the GDPR, which provides exemptions for data transfers that are necessary for important reasons of public interest, that would not only address our concerns with regard to WHOIS, but would also address the potential interruption of US-EU cooperation in many other public interest areas. Absent a broader interpretation of Article 49, a short-term moratorium on GDPR enforcement with regard to WHOIS would be necessary. If not, then come May 25th, we anticipate registries and registrars who have already started to curtail access to WHOIS data will stop providing access to WHOIS directories and service. The loss of access to WHOIS will negatively affect law enforcement for cybercrimes, cybersecurity, and intellectual property rights protection activities globally. To all of you who know the importance of these issues, I ask that you make your voices heard. Another major priority area is our preparations for the ITU's treaty-making conference, the ITU Plenipotentiary, scheduled for October. The United States will be pressing for changes to the ITU, including establishing effective membership oversight, which is particularly important given the ITU's roles in radio communications and development. We need an ITU that can be effective and efficient in performing its vital spectrum management functions, and one that fosters pro-competitive policies for telecom, particularly in developing countries. We also need to push back against efforts aggressively to move the ITU into internet-related and cybersecurity matters. A government-centric approach to cybersecurity would harm innovation and impede cybersecurity progress towards real solutions. While on the topic of the ITU, I don't want to be all doom and gloom. I would like to ask you to join our administration in supporting Ms. Doreen Bogdan-Martin, who is our candidate to lead the ITU's development sector. Doreen is a former NTIA employee, was a champion of pro-growth and competition policies during her time at NTIA, and has spent the last 25 years working at the ITU on development policy. If elected, Doreen would not only be the first American, but also the first woman elected to any of the ITU's executive team positions in its 150-year history. She is exactly the kind of leader they need. To close, I want to again thank the NSTAC members for their hard work. American innovation and our success in the global economy rely on an open, secure, and resilient internet ecosystem. Botnets and other automated distributed threats threaten the vibrancy of this great enabler of all of our economies and all of our communications. I know that if government and industry work together, we can solve our shared problems and continue to pave the way for the advancement of the technologies we all rely on. Thanks very much for having me here today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Idle, for your comments. Any questions from any of the members? If not, hearing no questions, we'll move to the next item on the agenda, which is an update on the NSTAC Cybersecurity Moonshot Subcommittee, led by Mr. McLaughlin and Mr. Altabef. I'll turn the floor over to both of you.
Great. Thanks, Renee. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to provide everyone an update along with Peter on the significant progress we've made on the Cyber Moonshot Subcommittee. We'll provide an overview of the key conclusions we reached to date, lay out the next steps for the subcommittee that intends to take as we study this topic through the issuance of the final report to the President, which we intend to deliver at the next in-person NSTAC meeting in Washington on November 4th. The Cybersecurity Moonshot Subcommittee officially launched on February 15th, and we've had a highly productive 3 months. Along with my co-chair, it's been a distinct honor to lead a group representing over 20 government, academia, and private industry entities from across the IT, telecommunications, and cybersecurity ecosystems. And since the launch, the subcommittee has held twice weekly meetings, received briefings from 13 external subject matter experts. And among these experts, we've intentionally began by hearing from individuals outside of the cybersecurity domain with direct experience or expertise in other moonshot-like efforts to identify best practices for how we've effectively marshaled national resources to meet grand challenges in the past. Representative examples include briefings on the Apollo program, the creation of the internet, USAID's grand challenges for global public health, and national scientific initiatives like the Human Genome Project and the BRAIN Initiative for Neurological Research. This is an important step in order to liberate thinking beyond the normal bounds that have often limited our national dialogue around cybersecurity. Subcommittee also heard from leading cybersecurity experts to begin identifying common organizing principles for a more inclusive national conversation about achieving a fundamentally safer and more secure cybersecurity environment. This initial fact-finding phase helped us identify common principles and key considerations that must be incorporated into a strategy for developing a nationally coordinated effort to more enduringly address the United States' systemic cybersecurity challenges. With that, I'll pass it over to Peter to continue on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Based on our conclusions to date, the subcommittee has agreed to a series of 5 shared principles that will continue to govern our approach through the conclusion of the study. You'll be pleased to know only one of them touches on fear. This is the one. The first principle is that we believe the status quo is unsustainable. We believe we sit at an inflection point in the cybersecurity environment. Digitally connected technologies are increasingly fundamental to our national security, public policy, economic prosperity, and overall way of life. But the cost of cyber attacks is rising as technology advances into more facets of our lives. Second, we need to be bolder and move beyond incrementalism. The complexity of cybersecurity, which cuts across matters of technology, people, and policy, has led to a tendency to compartmentalize the challenge into its individual components. Cybersecurity is a highly distributed challenge, as we heard from our debaters. No one entity from government, private security, or academia can address the challenge unilaterally. These characteristics have led us to conceptualize solutions in ways that are often too fragmented, reactive, or incremental in nature, addressing discrete challenges but not proactively preventing cyber attacks, or reducing systemic cybersecurity risk on the holistic basis it requires. Third, this unsustainable reality demands a new approach, and as a core principle, we seek a more aspirational national vision for cybersecurity. A few times in our nation's history, we've made the determination on a national basis that an issue was so critical to our shared interest that we had no choice but to figure it out, that failure simply wasn't an option. We believe cybersecurity has risen to that level and requires a call to action from the highest levels of government. We also believe a call to action that generates skepticism about its feasibility is inherently valuable for its potential to provoke productive national conversations. To achieve that outcome, what would we need to figure out from a technology standpoint? How would we reform our educational system? How would our supply chain policies change? We think these are productive questions. But government can't, of course, do this alone, and our fourth principle is that we need to foster stronger whole-of-nation action. We believe government, in close collaboration with private industry and academia, can lead in catalyzing this more inclusive process to harness the collective resources and energies of the nation. And finally, while the strategic vision we're developing is necessarily a longer-term endeavor, We believe a cybersecurity moonshot vision can generate immediate and near-term benefits. We believe accelerated whole-of-nation action towards a fundamentally safer cybersecurity environment could produce exponential effects, just as the national mobilization around the space program led to the development of unexpected innovations in medicine and material science. Mark?
And with that, I'll cover our next steps in the call to action. So, with those shared principles governing us, the subcommittee will continue to work on a final report to the President. The report will ultimately represent a cybersecurity moonshot action plan with clear strategic recommendations and actionable steps the United States government can take, in close partnership with private industry and academia, to launch a coordinated, whole-of-nation approach to a more sustainably address this challenge. To accomplish this, the subcommittee will be focused on two objectives in the near term. First, the subcommittee will continue to bring more definitional clarity to the high-level organizing principles of the moonshot vision. How do we more effectively frame the cybersecurity challenge in an outcome-focused way that galvanizes action aligned to key strategic work streams? What is our moonshot equivalent aspirational statement for the cybersecurity environment, and how will we deliver that message? And secondly, we'll continue to build out a strategic framework for operationalizing this effort in a way that is distributed across diverse stakeholder sets to foster innovation, but still aligned with shared national and like-minded country interests. This objective will be focused on providing strategic recommendations related to a complex set of questions related to the initiative's governance, policy, budget, and other key considerations. This meeting marks an important milestone in subcommittee's work, but is ultimately the early stages of what we envision as an iterative, collaborative effort that must extend far more broadly to the diverse set of stakeholders who possess the capabilities and the shared responsibility for national cybersecurity. This is an issue we need to be unabashedly optimistic about, because it's challenged, we simply need to figure out in a more sustainable way. As Peter said, failure is not an option. This isn't going to be easy, but the NSTAC is committed to the hard work necessary to provide our U.S. government counterparts with actionable strategic recommendations related to the substance and structure for this more transformative effort. Thank you, Madam Chair. That concludes our report.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. I'll now open the floor for questions to Mark and Peter about the progress of their subcommittee or the topic. Any questions? No, says Helen. There are no questions. If there are no questions, we will look forward to discussing the recommendation at our next meeting, which I believe is on November 14th in Washington, D.C. So with that, we've come to the end of the formal agenda. I'll ask Mr. Schneider if you have any closing remarks you'd like to make.
Thanks, Renee. Just a thank you again to the NSTAC, to the members, to everyone that participated here today. Look forward to the output and the outcomes from the Moonshot study. I think that is going to definitely be things that we can fold in as we do our policy development and as we really do look at ways that we can enhance cybersecurity for the nation, both in the systems we run and operate from a government standpoint, and all of those, because the vast majority of them that are run and operated by private industry as well. This is a game that requires collaboration, requires partnership, both between government and industry and internationally as well. Phil and Ian, want to thank both of you for being here today and providing us your insights and the continued partnership we have with you as also. So thank you very much. Renee, back to you.
Thank you. Mr. Krebs, any final closing comments for the day?
Just some housekeeping notes and then just a kind of a closing vision. I have to say, in the 5 years that I've been attending NSTAC meetings in one capacity or another, this is the one that I'm coming out of, frankly, with the glimmer of hope that we have a shared vision of where we need to go. I think the organizing principle out of the Moonshot is exactly what's needed at this time right now. We have common understanding of the environment, the risk environment. We know, for instance, that fear is not our ally. We think we know where we need to go, and we just need to develop the roadmap and the framework on how to get there. So looking forward to the next meeting. And I know on behalf of the Secretary, we are looking forward to that. And she will also be reaching out to each of you. One of the concepts that we're trying to foster here is this persistent contact or persistent engagement. Usually you use that for the adversary, but in partnership terms, we also need to get tighter circles in terms of how we engage and how frequently we engage. This is a group that has an incredible amount of talent, knowledge, and skill. And as I tell my team each day, it's, you know, when you pull something together and you think you have the answer, go ask the private sector. Is that what they need? And are we on the right track? It's what do they need and how can we help? So from a vision kind of wrapper here, one of the things that I think continues to come out of these conversations is alone we're going to fail. Together we can at least achieve some degree of real meaningful progress. And it's not just whether it's a single company or single government or the NSTAC. We need to be continue to extend our perimeters and include hard infrastructure in these conversations. So NIAC is one group I've mentioned before that I think NSTAC needs to work a little bit closer with, and we'll be working that out. And on the hard infrastructure note, I would like to acknowledge a couple folks came in town for this one. Jim Torgeson from Avangard and Brian Skelton from Tullahoma Utilities Authority. They attended. I think it's one of the first times I've heard hard infrastructure folks come into a meeting and sit through one of these conversations, because they know the talent and expertise in this room. So appreciate you guys coming in town. And again, I'll just reiterate, alone we're going to fail on this. So together, collectively, we can achieve the security outcomes we need, and really appreciate all the hard work that you put in, but also your points of contact and your support team. It's twice weekly meetings to discuss the moonshot. That is a lot of overhead that you guys are burning on this. So really do appreciate everything you're putting into it. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's meeting. I, too, think this was a very productive set of both closed-door and open discussions. And I'd like to thank both Mr. Snyder and Mr. Krebs for championing the NSTAC. I think everyone, and I speak on behalf of the NSTAC, is very enthusiastic about the moonshot and our ability to align together. I would be remiss if I did not thank Ms. Helen Jackson, who is our coordinator and puts all of this together and gets us all here and organized. Thank you, Helen, for your very hard work. Thank you, gentlemen, for the lively debate. We appreciated that and your thoughts. And finally, the NSTAC members in general, thank you all for coming to dinner last night, for your contributions. I know this is a big time commitment out of your day jobs. Our next meeting is going to be a conference call of the members on August 15th. So mark your calendars, please. Again, our next in-face meeting is in Washington, D.C., November 14th. We'll have the recommendation from the current study. And I think we don't have any additional comments. Mr. Charney, do you have anything you'd like to add? If not, I'd like a motion to adjourn. Okay. I love doing that. The meeting is closed. Thank you.